Hello. Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Calypso Nicolaides, professor here at the Kennedy School. And in the name of the school, in the name of the ARCO Forum, and in the name of the Marshall Committee of the Kennedy School, I would like to welcome Ambassador Hugo Pamen to the school. And as you all know, Ambassador Pamen is going to speak about the European Union and the United States in the next millennium, together or apart. This is a very important issue for us here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard this year. Of course, it's an important issue for anybody in the US, in Europe, around the world. Transatlantic relations are clearly shaping world stability, world growth. They're key. But we have a special reason here at Harvard for speaking about transatlantic relations this semester, which is the fact, as we all know, that we are celebrating the Marshall Plan speech, which was given 50 years ago at Harvard. And it is in this context that we invited Ambassador Pamen to close the first series of events that we've had at Harvard related to the Marshall Plan celebration, and before a last set of events that we will have in June. Obviously, Mr. Pamen, Ambassador Pamen, is best fitted to discuss these issues with us. As you all know, he's the European Commission's head of delegation and ambassador in Washington, and he was nominated there in July '95. Before that, he was an insider in Brussels, since he was the Commission's Deputy Director General for External Relations and was very involved in the Uruguay round. Indeed, he was so involved that he wrote a book about it, which came out recently, entitled From the GATT to the WTO, the European Community in the Uruguay round. He wrote a book in part because he's also an academic. He has been visiting professor and he has degrees in philosophy and classics and political and social science. So he takes a social sciences view, I think, sometimes, as well as his view as a civil servant of the European Union. And he has been, of course, a career diplomat from Belgium in the embassies in Geneva, in Paris, in Washington in the last 20 years. So he's had an amazing breadth of experience. He can tell us tonight about the current state of transatlantic relations, some of the hot economic issues, of course, like Helms-Burton or other, and more broader structural issues. Where are we going? Where are we going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What can he say from his standpoint? But let me also say that during the question-answer period, you are free to ask questions about what is happening inside the European Union as well, since it is relevant to our debate on transatlantic relations. So Ambassador Pamen is going to speak for something like 10 or 15 minutes, not very long, because I told him that here at the Kennedy School we like dialogue and discussion, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Thank you for being here with us, Ambassador Pamen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Calypso. I'm very honored to be here, and especially to see in the audience a certain number of people I have seen before and have very good relations with. I was with great insistence instructed to be very short, so I'm afraid I will have to apply to this statement the rule which I learned as a young diplomat about after-dinner speeches. The rule is the following. It says that you try to have a good introduction, and you try to have a very good conclusion, and you bring the two as close together as you can. So I'll try to do it on the United States, Europe, and Europe in the next millennium, which is not a small subject to deal with in 10 or 15 minutes, but I do my best. United States and Europe have today and have built up over the last years a kind of relationship which is unique in the world. There's nowhere in the world a relationship between two entities which would be able to have the following characteristics. We have a trade relationship of about $200 billion and in balance. One day it's a little bit more for the European Union, one year, another year it's more on the American side. It depends to some extent of the exchange rates, but even more on more macroeconomic aspects. This means the demand and the growth on both sides of the Atlantic. Secondly, between the United States and Europe, we have an 800 billion investment stock, which is also amazingly balanced. It's about $400 billion in both sides. And to give perhaps an even more clear indication about the degree of interdependence relationship between the United States and Europe, 3 million jobs in the United States depend on European investment here in this country. But also 3 million European jobs depend on American investments in Europe. So you understand, nowhere in the world you have this intense, close relationship. I could you give other figures about investment and so on. More than 55% of foreign investment in Europe is American investment. More or less 45% of all foreign direct investment in the United States is European investment, and so on. It's a very, very close, intense, very interdependent relationship. And this, notwithstanding that, certainly today we are in a quite different situation. So on the one hand, you have elements which would go into the direction of convergence, but there are also elements of divergence. And I'll give you some examples. Today, the United States is the only one geopolitical power. I don't have to expand on that. Since 1989, it's clear there's only one superpower in the world. It's the United States. It's a political, it's a military superpower without any comparison in the world. Secondly, economic situation in the United States is about the best which you can imagine these days in the world. You have an unemployment situation which is, 5.2, 5.3%. You have an inflation of, 2.5%. You would pass with flying colors the so-called convergence criteria for the economic and monetary union in Europe. And against that, you have a situation which you are familiar with in Europe, where we are trying to meet a certain number of challenges with quite a lot of difficulties. First of all, economic and monetary union, which we try painfully to put together. Secondly, we have a big issue about enlargement. We are 15 today, but 10 others are at our doorstep. And we have absolutely to adjust our institutional setup, because we live with institutions which had been put together when there were only 6 members of the European Union at that time, the European Community. We are also very uncertain about our geopolitical vocation, I would say. Our economic situation is not very good. We have now, 11% unemployment. Inflation has come down, happily, but we are also very schizophrenic about what our future is going to be, and that especially our destiny, our destiny in a globalizing world against which a lot of people try to defend themselves. So there are, on the one hand, elements which bring us together, go into the direction of convergence. There are also a lot of indications which would think that perhaps we could well, in the future, in the near future, develop in a different direction. And I was asked to talk also a little bit about more contested issues like Helms-Burton and so on. Perhaps we can do it during the question and answer session. But it's clear that based on that, you could imagine that the dynamics of the United States, also because of the growing markets, the interesting part of the world, also the more problematic parts of the world are outside. And the United States has done a major effort, as you know, with countries in Asia, Europeans tried to do the same, but it's clear that the United States has been more successful in terms of presence, not in terms of trade balance, as you know, but certainly in terms of presence in Asia. Could well be that on a certain number of external issues, we could go into different directions. Example, China. As you know, there is the big question about letting China in the World Trade Organization, and let's say in general, our policy vis-à-vis China. The United States has an annual self-inflicted trauma of whether, yes or no, MFN should be given to imports coming from China. We have decided, 5, 7, 8 years ago, MFN for China once and for all, no problem. Second element of our China policy, the United States is very, very difficult about the conditions under which China could become a member of the World Trade Organization. We think it's better to have them in than to have them out. Of course, you have to have a minimum of conditions. If you join a club, you have to live up to the rules of the club. But we think you also have to take into account the position in which the country is. And again, especially a country of the dimension, a country of the potential of China, it's better to have them in than to have them out. You have a very good expression here in the United States for that, which I'm not going to repeat. It's about a tent, but I'll let you think of it. So the question is, will the divergent factors prevail, or will the convergent factors prevail? Of course, people are aware of this, and that's why in November 1995 there was the new Transatlantic Agenda, which was approved by President Clinton and the President Santer for the European Commission and the Prime Minister of Spain, who at that time was the President of the European Council of Ministers. And it was exactly because of them being aware that after 1989, perhaps it was not so evident that under the protection of, I would say, the NATO alliance, the relationship between the United States and Europe was no problem, could not be a problem, we couldn't afford it to be a problem, then that situation perhaps would not go on. Exactly because of that feeling that it was not evident, that it shouldn't be taken for granted automatically anymore, that this idea of a new transatlantic agenda came up. I'm not going to be going into the details. I was told that the students are all very familiar with the basics of it, so I should not go into the details. But it's good to know that in this new transatlantic agenda we have 4 chapters. The first chapter is how can we go from the traditional consultation in terms of foreign policy to more systematic cooperation and even common actions in terms of foreign policy. The second chapter is about economic relations, and there the major challenge is going to be, of course, the day that we will have made economic and monetary union. How is the dialogue going to be organized between, on the one hand, one person who is going to talk in the name of the dollar, on the other hand, a person who is going to talk in the name of the euro, and of course, in the International Monetary Fund, other countries like Japan, perhaps tomorrow China, and so on. But let's say it's going to be mainly the United States and Europe who will have to or work together or make each life difficult. It's that the basis for the cooperation in economic affairs. The third chapter of this new transatlantic agenda was about what was called the global issues. Global issues there, it was understood that in our new, mature, post-industrial society, the domestic problems in the United States and the problems in Europe are more or less the same. And it is about domestic security, it's about how to fight against drug trafficking, about terrorism, about environment issues, and so on. All this, it was agreed that we would try to work together, given that the problems, to a large extent, are put into in the same terms on both sides of the Atlantic. And the fourth thing, the fourth chapter of the new transatlantic agenda was about building bridges. It was building upon the success of what happened after the Second World War, the Fulbright initiative and so on. How can we bring together people also at a level which is a non-governmental level? It's about having the people of the Parliament and Congress talking to each other, non-governmental organizations like the trade unions. We have a workshop in 2 weeks from now in Washington for the very first time between trade unions in Europe and the trade unions in the United States. And we would like to have this happen with a lot of other non-governmental organizations, again, to bring the communities together. So this is, are the great lines of this new transatlantic agenda. I have to admit that the challenge to make this real is to a large extent on the European side, because we have to decide how we are going to be the interlocutor, how we are going to organize. It's the famous telephone number of Kissinger. He didn't know who to call for foreign policy. They don't know who to call for monetary policy in Europe for the moment. And that's not only true for foreign policy, for monetary policy, it's true for a lot of areas. So it's to a large extent the Europeans who have to get their act together in order to be a full, respected, reliable interlocutor for the United States. That's going to be, to a large extent, that will to a large extent depend on our politicians, our statesmen, and in fact whether our politicians will be statesmen. And you know what the difference is between a politician and a statesman. A statesman is a politician who thinks of his grandchildren. Thank you.
Not too long.
Certainly we're sure that your grandchildren will be proud.
We'll see.
Well, Ambassador Pammon said that he wouldn't enter into details during his speech, but now is the time to enter into the actual detail of these broad questions through your questions and the issues you want to address. So please, Jean, and if you can go to the microphone, and be heard by everybody. Can make statements if you want.
Thank you. I had a question regarding the statements that Commissioner Van Meert made about the proposed merger between Lockheed and Boeing. Could you please tell us something about the position of the Justice Department?
You mean Boeing and McDonnell?
I'm sorry, that's what I meant, yes. Justice and the State Departments.
Yeah. As you know, we have a common competition policy in Europe, and all major mergers of a certain importance have to be screened by the institution, by the Commission, the people what we call DG4, in order to see whether they don't infringe upon the rules of fair competition. Now, we have a very special situation in the aircraft business because we have only, in fact, in the world, 3 aircraft builders. We have the major one is Boeing. Then you have here in the United States McDonnell. You have, of course, Lockheed, but that's mainly military. And then we have Airbus. So that's, to start with, is already, I would say, a specific situation for aircraft. The question is now whether if 2 of these 3 builders of aircraft merge, if that's going to let competition still do its normal work, have a normal competitive environment. In Europe, we think that there is a problem because of, and there comes in a new phenomenon, this new development that Boeing has made, as probably you know, agreements with a certain number of airlines, and that goes over 20 years, where the airlines, like American Airlines, like Delta, and like Continental, commit themselves to buy only Boeing airlines for 20 years. You have to admit that if you have 3 major airlines committing themselves for 20 years, buying only Boeing airplanes, there could at least be a potential problem in terms of competition. That's what's being examined these days by DG4. They haven't come to a conclusion yet, but I think I can tell you that's not going to be an easy one. And I would not be surprised at the result, but I can't anticipate, but there could well be a problem. I leave it there.
Just getting back to the point, what is the position of the Justice Department under U.S. antitrust law? Is it significantly different from the European position? And how does the State Department see European Commission delving into something that a priori should be only an internal U.S. affair? It's basically a two-point thing.
Well, first of all, what the antitrust division of the Justice Department hasn't come to a conclusion yet. Mr. Van Meert was in Washington 10 days ago. I went with him to see Janet Reno, the Minister of Justice, and they had a very nice conversation, but it couldn't go into the details because those inquiries, those examinations happen according to a certain set of rules, and they should happen in that way. So we will have to wait until as well the antitrust division in the United States as our DG4 will have come to a conclusion. The second part of your question is why do you have to have an opinion on that? Because it's a typical American affair. No, it's not only an American affair, it's a world affair. First of all, because an airplane is a world product. And in order to see whether a producer of aircraft has a dominant position in the market, everybody agrees you have to take into consideration the world market, it's world product. Moreover, a certain number of European airlines, as you know, buy Boeing aircraft, and they are very satisfied with the Boeing aircraft. That's not a problem, but they are very active in Europe, Boeing, and so was McDonnell. So we have to have an examination on how the European market will be affected by the merger between Boeing and McDonnell. And the same would happen if there was a European merger which would affect the American market, exactly the same, and that's accepted.
I'd like to take this area of discussion a little bit further and get your opinion on what will happen during trade discussions between the European Union and the United States when they reach a point of impasse. What is a dispute resolution mechanism? And specifically, while I was in Europe, I was talking to one of the negotiators on the mutual recognition agreements on the pharmaceutical industry. And he was saying that those discussions between the United States and Europe, which has a very different value system, a very different way of negotiating, we're really at a standstill. So my question is, if there is a very different point of view between the two sides, how can it be resolved? Or looking on a broader level, will it be circumvented in the hopes of making the transatlantic agenda a solid and nice thing?
Well, amazingly, the trade area is the area where we have the least real problems with the United States, contrary to what happened before. You remember we had chicken wars, we had steel wars, we had wars all over the place between the United States and Europe in the past. Today we don't have wars anymore. And I think that one of the reasons why we don't have wars anymore is because the Europeans have got their act together in trade policy matters. Because there it's clear. There are clear procedures how to come to a common position, and there are clear procedures who is negotiating. It's the European Commission. The European Commission negotiates with the Americans. So there is no dispute about the legitimacy of the interlocutor. That's one thing. Secondly, we have together done the Uruguay round. And as you know, in the Uruguay round, we have introduced a new dispute settlement system for which we can go to the World Trade Organization if we don't get our act together bilaterally. So this is a threat which is always above us. When we can't solve our problems bilaterally, the other party knows that one of the two can go to the WTO, to the dispute settlement, and so on. Now, MRAs, and for those who are not familiar with the jargon, MRAs are mutual recognition agreements. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and it comes out of our discussions with the industry after the Uruguay round. We asked our industry what is going to be, after the finishing and the implementation of the results of the Uruguay round, the main trade barrier in your external activities. There was nearly unanimous answer on our side. It's standardization, it's certification, recognition of tests and laboratories and so on. So that's why we said we could perhaps try to do worldwide, and let's start with the United States, what we have done within the European Union. You remember that in the beginning the European Union tried to harmonize everything. We tried to decide what kind of bread we would eat, what kind of noise our lawnmowers were allowed to make, and all this type of details. And systematically we were overtaken by events, because as soon as experts after 2-3 years had come to an agreement on a standard for one or the other product, the technology had made that this product was out of date, and we could start all over again. And we came to the conclusion that harmonization like that was a bad solution. And we came to implement a very practical rule, which is based on the following principle: what is good for a Frenchman cannot be bad for a German. As simple as that. In other words, a product which can be produced, which can be sold on the market of one of our member states, automatically is recognized as a good product for all other countries. We thought that we had arrived at a degree of interdependence with the United States that we could do the same thing. What's good for a European cannot be bad for an American. What's good for an American cannot be bad for a European. That's the basis of the philosophy of the mutual recognition agreements. Now, you mentioned pharmaceuticals. Yes, we are in a big negotiation with the United States. Yes, we are stuck in that negotiation. We are stuck to a large extent, I think I can say it, because of your famous FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Administration. Because the Food and Drug Administration has its law, and it has its competence through a law. And what you look for in a mutual recognition agreement is, of course, that the Food and Drug Administration would give up its competence, because it has to recognize what we do in Europe, just like we have to give up our competence to control the products, the standards, and so on in the United States. That's something which is very difficult for the Food and Drug Administration, because they think it's their essence, their reason to exist is to control everything. And they have done a good job in the past. We have no problems with that. But the basic philosophy of a mutual recognition agreement is that you don't do the control. So no Food and Drug Administration. And that's a bit too much for them for the moment. But we'll try to get out of that.
Does the EU have a strategy on how to address these splits between the United States policy from the executive branch being divergent from that from the legislative or the regulatory agencies?
Oh, that's another issue, of course, and that's part of the fact that constitutionally in the United States, treaties have to be concluded by the Senate, not by the administration, but by the Congress. So whatever international agreement, whatever agreement or treaty is concluded has to be approved by Congress in the United States. By the way, it's the same in most of our countries. The Parliament has also to approve. But it's more explicitly said in your Constitution that the Senate is responsible for the treaty, is in fact the treaty-making power in the United States. So up to a certain point, we have problems when we negotiate with an American official, because we never know whether, when he is going to go home, he is going to have the approval of the Congress. And on the other hand, the Congress can sometimes decide on legislation which has effects on the outside. And there comes in, for instance, the Helms-Burton legislation. We couldn't avoid it. It is the so-called extraterritorial application of domestic law, which is the big problem we have with Helms-Burton. So in two ways we have a problem which we can solve, but it's a difficulty. It's an inherent difficulty. The first problem the United States has tried to solve itself by what is called a fast track. As you know, regularly in the trade laws, the United States Congress gives what is called a fast track to the administration, which is giving the administration the possibility to negotiate about a certain number of issues taken together and then go to the United States Congress, and the United States Congress will only say yes or no. In other words, there's a commitment that they will not change it. If they are not satisfied, they will say no, and then there's no agreement. But the other alternative is yes, not saying yes for part of it and no for another part of it. Or you take it or you leave it. And that's, of course, very helpful, and that's what you had in the Uruguay round. We would never have made the Uruguay round if the United States wouldn't have had a fast track, absolutely clear. Up to a certain point, we have also a fast track in the European Union. It's not as clearly spelled out in our legislation, but in practice it's about the same. When the Commission goes negotiating in Geneva for 5 years, and you go back to the Council of Ministers, you have created practically the same situation. Or they say yes or they say no, because they can't start trying to improve this or that, because then you say there's no agreement. For the second problem, which is that the Congress sometimes has a tendency to make laws with an international implication, we have no solution. And we have to count on the wisdom of the Congress not to do things which would create problems to the United States. But as you have learned, that wisdom is, seen from our point of view at least, not always there.
I have several questions. The first one is about the Helms-Burton Act. When we were in Europe, we met with, amongst others, the representative of the US to the EU, and he mentioned that he didn't understand why the European Union ended up deciding to take the case to the WTO instead of doing some sort of a retaliatory action. And some of the officials we talked with mentioned that it might be because the European Union seems to focus a lot on the process and not so much on the actual goal of their act. So, yeah, my first question is, why in your assessment did the European Union choose to take the case to the WTO? And how did they come about bringing it back from that again?
Okay. So the Helms-Burton, you know what it's all about. It's about the trade relations with Cuba, and more particularly the United States Congress has foreseen a certain number of sanctions imposed upon people who are doing trade, what they call trafficking in stolen goods, with Cuba. When this legislation was approved, we did two things. The first thing was that we approved our own legislation, which is called the blocking statute, and which is legislation which neutralizes the effects of Helms-Burton in Europe, on European citizens and on European business people, which is a current thing to do. That's exactly what the United States did in the 70s when there was an embargo by the Arabs for dealing with Israel. So we had a blocking statute. The problem was that we couldn't get approval in the Council of Ministers for this blocking statute very quickly. Like very often, our decision-making doesn't go very quickly, very fast, and the Council of Ministers thought that they had to act immediately, so they did not only finally the blocking statute, which was approved after 3 or 4 meetings, but we also brought the case before the WTO. Because the WTO, as I said before, has a special dispute settlement system. Now, I know that the United States was very worried about this because the argument was This is a very political issue, has to do with national security, seen from the United States. So you should not bring these things before the World Trade Organization. Moreover, the World Trade Organization is a very young organization. It hasn't gone through enough experience to deal with these type of issues. And in any case, it was said there is an Article 21 in the agreement of the World Trade Organization that says that in matters of national security, the traditional trade rules can be overruled. We thought that, first of all, if you have a World Trade Organization, you better use it, because it doesn't make much sense to, after 7 years of negotiations, to create a World Trade Organization, and then, when you have a real case, not to use it. It would make your World Trade Organization completely irrelevant. And secondly, we thought that the argument of the national security was not very well founded. It's all good for the United States to think that its national security is threatened by Cuba. We have some doubts about that, but okay, it's for the United States to consider whether they really think that they are threatened in their national security interest by the existence of Cuba, which, by the way, has been there for quite a while, as you know. But okay, it's for the United States to decide this. But what we have problems with, to understand, is that the European Union would be a threat for the national security of the United States. And that was the reason why we thought that we could well put to the test Article 21 of the WTO. Now, as we are friends and we have a tradition to work together and to try to solve the problems between us first, we have agreed for a while now, about 3 weeks ago, that we would take another 6 months to try to solve the problem between us. So what we did was to suspend the case before the WTO until the 15th of October and see whether we couldn't come to a bilateral agreement on that issue. So we'll see. That's the story.
What would it take for the European Union to be satisfied with bringing back the case?
Well, the agreement is the following. It is that we have to see whether we can come to common language in terms of essentially two things. First of all, how you deal with trade in goods which are nationalized or expropriated in a given country. How is it dealt with internationally? That's one thing. The second objective of the exercise, which is going to last for 6 months, is to know how are we going to solve the problem of what is called a secondary embargo. And the secondary embargo is exactly what I explained, that happened between the United States and Europe in relation with Cuba. The United States imposing sanctions on the European Union because the United States not being in a position to solve its problems with Cuba. That is the problem of the secondary embargo, and that's what we call extraterritorial application of domestic law. And we have two major issues, two major problems with the whole problem of Helms-Burton and in fact also of the D'Amato Bill. It's the problem of economic sanctions. We think that economic sanctions should not exist in our international relations unless they have been decided collectively in a wider context with all the interested parties agreeing. In fact, this boils down to having a resolution of the United Nations, as we have done with Libya, for instance. There are provisions in the United Nations, a resolution on trade with Libya, which the United States respects and which we respect, but it has gone through the mechanism of the United States because the whole world is shocked by the way in which Libya has been behaving, and so it is a good reason to have economic sanctions. But unilaterally decided economic sanctions, we think, should not exist. You know where you start, but you don't know where you stop with economic sanctions. Secondly, we think that economic sanctions, if they are unilaterally decided, are completely useless. There's not one example in history where unilateral sanctions have been effective. Not one. There are examples where they have helped, but in the wider context, like South Africa, for instance, like Poland at a certain moment, in Yugoslavia and so on, but never, at least in recent history, I have to be careful because there are historians in the room which could correct me when I go further back than the 20th century, but at least in the 20th century, I have no example of that economic sanctions, unilaterally sanctions, would work. That's, I would say, the political side of it. The legal side of it is what I mentioned. It's extraterritorial application of domestic legislation. If you start to do that, if the United States can do it today because of Cuba, who is going to do it tomorrow on whatever other issue? Could be China, could be India, could be a very interesting market for us. And if we accept that the rules of the games can be unilaterally decided as a consequence of domestic legislation, you know your international relations are messed up and you don't know where you stop there too. So we have quite strong feelings about that, as you hear.
I was just going to just ask you one more step, which is connect this to the previous question in telling us what your personal experience as the EU ambassador in the US has been in dealing with this problem. Do you go and speak to Jesse Helms? Who do you speak with? How do you live this from here as opposed to those who we spoke with in our trip to Brussels who actually speak elsewhere? You are dealing with this on an ongoing basis, and how is that different?
Well, yes, we talk with I would say, nearly everybody in Washington. But for the moment, the status of the Helms-Burton is that it is a law. It has been approved by Congress. It has been signed by the President, has been approved by the Congress with an overwhelming majority in a context which we all know. It was election period, the planes were shot down, and so on. This increased certainly the majority of by which it has been approved, and I know of a certain, at least one congressman who has said publicly that he considers that it is the major mistake of his political career to have approved Helms-Burton. And I know of more than one who considered that they shouldn't have done it. But okay, that apart, it is for the moment law in the United States, and the United States administration is obliged to apply the law. We have no problem with that. We have to apply our law. The United States has to apply its law. So our interlocutor for the moment is the administration, because the law is there. And as you know, the President has designated one person particularly to try to come to a solution on Helms-Burton, which is the former ambassador of the United States in Brussels, Stu Eisenstadt. And I think over the last 2 or 3 months, I have talked at least 2 or 3 times a day with Eisenstadt. So we try to find a solution for that. But we also talk with Congress. And I very much hope that between now and the 15th of October, which is the deadline, we will be able to come to a solution.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the questions, but my second question is much more of a general question in the transatlantic relationship. It seemed from our trip also that for the moment the European Union is very much concerned with the EMU and with enlargement, and that it seems very unlikely that there will be a major revolution or that there will be a major step forward in the transatlantic relationship the coming maybe 5 to 10 years. And the strategy for the European Union in that regard, is that then to do what has been done internally over a long period, setting up institutions and setting up the framework for a relationship which might then be filled up later? And is it could the transatlantic agenda and the action plan be seen as such, or can it be seen as an actual step forward?
Well, I very much hope that you are wrong, that there will be a lot of progress in the context of the new transatlantic agenda between the United States and Europe. That's in any case what we try to do. And there are all reasons to do it. We do economic and monetary union, so it's a good reason to discuss with the Americans macroeconomic policy. And we can start tomorrow if that is possible. So there's no reason not to intensify the discussions with the United States on that. We have a big discussion with the United States about enlargement. Because, as you know, we have two enlargements on our program. Not only the enlargement of the European Union, but also the enlargement of NATO. Now, there is a question. The two are, in principle, completely separated because they have their own dynamism and their own bases, their own reasons. But it's clear, it's about the same countries, more or less. It's about the same area of the world. So how can we coordinate enlargement of the European Union with the enlargement of NATO? And in one, the United States is present. In the other, the United States is not present. And there are differences in, I would say, not the basic objectives, but in the way in which to approach this. It's clear for the United States the absolute priority is enlargement of NATO. It's clear, because they want to have a clear view on how Europe is going to look like, and more particularly how their relations with Russia are going to be, and how Russia is going to be affected by the enlargement of NATO, and which are going to be the countries who will be in NATO, and those who are not going to be taken up in NATO, what's going to happen to them? The Baltics, for instance. What is going to happen to the Baltics? Baltics will not be taken up in NATO for obvious reasons. So the United States has a tendency to say, we cannot take care of the Baltics now through enlargement of NATO. You, European Union, you should do it. And they have a tendency to put pressure on the European Union to take up the Baltics in the European Union. We think that perhaps the moment is not yet there to have the Baltics have a vocation to be become a member of the European Union like all other European countries. But we think that it is not that easy to become a member of the European Union. In fact, the worst thing which could happen to a lot of these East European countries today is to become a member of the European Union. Because becoming a member of the European Union is being taken up of the single European market, which means that if you are not competitive, you are out of the market. It's finished with your industry. So they are clearly not competitive. There's such a difference of degree of economic development between those countries and the European Union that it would be detrimental to the normal economic development of those countries to become a member of the European Union. I'll give you an example. The 10 countries which are presently candidate to become a member of the European Union in Central and Eastern Europe together have a gross domestic product of which is equal to Holland. The 10 together have a gross domestic product equal to Holland. So you see what a difference there is in terms of economic development. So that's for the moment not possible. But for political reasons, of course, the United States has a tendency to say, what we can't take care of through enlargement of NATO, you, European Union, you should take over from us. There's a second aspect, economic and monetary union. The United States is not opposed, I think, to economic and monetary union, but it's not a priority for them. For us, it is a priority, because it is the next natural step in a process of gradual integration. So for us, we want to do it, and we want to do it before we do enlargement. So you see that there are a certain number of nuances and a certain number of differences in priorities, which if we don't take care of them, and if we don't manage them well, and if we don't discuss them all the time, from morning to evening, nearly every day, in order to see how far we can diverge and have different opinions between, without really have a serious discussion or a serious, I would say, before they become irritants, before they become real problems with it, you have to discuss it, as I said, nearly on a day-to-day basis.
So there is even more dialogue on questions of internal European Union affairs, because we heard, I could take a quote saying about enlargement and the US trying to get involved, we asked them politely to stay out of our business. That's
Well, by definition, the enlargement of the European Union is European business. But as I said, the United States has some ideas about this. And they are free to have ideas about it, and they are even free to say what their ideas are. And we have to take into account that there is also the other dimension of the security and the enlargement and NATO and the influence which both processes have on each other. It's so evident that you cannot deny that there is, in one way or another, a link, even if you say that the two will be conducted on their own merits. You have to take into account that there is a wider context.
Sorry, again on this link, every time I want to push you to tell us how you deal about something from Washington, and on this question of the link between the two enlargements, it is, as you were describing, an ambiguous thing since the U.S. is not part of one, but we've been inquiring whether there is any strategic thinking about this link, whether people discuss it in policy circles explicitly, whether when the U.S. goes to Yeltsin and when Clinton goes to Yeltsin and actually sells, as you were talking about, sells EU enlargement as a compensation for non-NATO enlargement, has he been talking with his EU counterpart before doing this? Are you being asked when you're in Washington, well, how should we think about the link? How should the U.S. and Europe coordinate about the link between the two enlargements? Is that the kind of discussion that you have? And if yes, even if they're very informal, what is being said?
The nature of informal discussions is that they are not revealed, because as soon as they are revealed, they are no longer informal. But yes, of course, they are discussed in Washington and also in Brussels. That's not that's the reality. But as you say, they are informal. There is, for the moment, no procedure to integrate discussions which are about purely European Union affairs on the one hand, and I would say security issues on the other hand. This goes back to a long, long tradition. That's why I don't remember who it is. Oh, it is Bob Hunter. Bob Hunter is the American ambassador in Brussels for NATO. And he says that in Brussels there are, in the same city, two institutions, but they act as if they are working on two different continents, which is true. There is a long tradition also in our national diplomacies, and that's true for the United States, but even more, of course, for the Europeans. In the European establishments, foreign policy establishments, we had for years diplomats who were considered as security diplomats, you know, the NATO people. And then you had the European Union people. And you were two different classes. And it was very rare that a diplomat would make a career and going from NATO activities to European Union activities. No, once you were on the track of NATO, you made your career in NATO affairs. And then you became ambassador in Poland, and then you went to the MBFR negotiations. Perhaps you could go to the United Nations, but you would never go to the permanent representation in Brussels with the European Union. So there were nearly two separate careers in our policy establishment. And that's still more or less true, I would say, for the older diplomats in Europe today. You have all or the mark that you are a NATO man or you are a European Union man. It's an indication that there are two worlds in Brussels, in the same city. You have two worlds. You have the NATO world and you have the European Union world. The idea is that they should talk together. And now, very progressively, this happens. Mr. Van den Broek now goes from time to time to meetings in NATO. But there we have the problem, which I said before, is of the spokesperson. There's no problem to talk in the name of European Union in areas where we have a common policy. And the whole economic area, trade policy, and so on. Commission can talk, there's no problem. We can negotiate, we have to report to the Council of Ministers, of course, and all these things. But the situation is clear. Not at all the case for NATO, for security things. So It's for the Europeans to have their act together. We have to have a common foreign policy and organize ourselves consequently so that we have the possibility to decide to conduct a European common foreign policy. It's not yet the case, but you know, the Europeans have a tradition to see the handwriting on the wall when they are with their back against it, which is physically not easy, but that's the situation.
Can you tell us what your opinion is on Mr. or Mrs. CFSP in this context, in the current IGC negotiations? Do you think who should be whether there should be a Mr. and Mrs. CFSP, whether France is going to be followed by the others? How do you feel as an EU ambassador about this question?
Well, I'm in favor of one person being the spokesman for Europe in foreign policy. There's no doubt about that. Now, it's clearly that's not what's going to come out of the Intergovernmental Conference. Apparently, the people haven't come yet to that degree of recognition of the real world that is going to be decided. There will not be one single person who will be designated as the Commission is for trade policy. There will not be, after the Intergovernmental Conference, one person that can go to Madeleine Albright and say, now I'm going to discuss with you Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and I speak in the name of Europe. I regret it, but it's not going to come out of the Intergovernmental Conference. What probably is going to come out of the Intergovernmental Conference is an improvement. It's an improvement in this way that there will be a trio, 3 persons, who will have to work together, and it will be the Commissioner in charge of external relations, and as you know, we are going to reorganize the Commission so that there is only one Commissioner, at least really responsible for external relations. It will be the Presidency, still, country or the Minister which had the responsibility of the Presidency, and as you know, they change every 6 months. And thirdly, the person in the Secretariat General who will be designated to follow more particularly the foreign policy. So it's a new form of troika, which we have now with the 3 presidencies. So there will be a new kind of troika. Now I'm predicting this. It could come out completely differently. But what I know from the works of the Intergovernmental Conference makes me think that that's what, at the end of the day, going to come out of it. It's an improvement, but it's not ideal. What?
From your Washington viewpoint, why is it an improvement? What would be your ideal solution?
One person.
How does it compare?
No, the ideal situation is one person. Whoever it is, I don't care, but one person. That's the only way in which you can do business with Madeleine Albright or with whoever. If they have one person, we have to have one person. And we have to organize ourselves so that this all happens in a democratic way, that decisions can be taken effectively, and that people think foreign policy. As I said before, there are 3 conditions for foreign policy. The first condition to have a common foreign policy is that people are paid to think common foreign policy. Today, nobody in Brussels is paid to think common foreign policy. The so-called common foreign policy we have today is the common denominator of 15 foreign policies. Of course, that doesn't work. So we have to have people who are just paid to do that. Like the Commission is paid to think foreign trade policy. We have to do it somewhere. Second condition is that you have a decision-making procedure which makes this happen in an efficient way. In other words, no unanimity. We have to come to decision-making which has majority voting. And thirdly, you have to agree on the spokesperson. And that's the answer to your question. One person.
Yeah. You said, just said one voice, but it might well be that different states in Europe have different interests, and they might be very powerful interests. You are the ambassador of the EU in the United States, and most of your time you talk about economics. Is this the future economization of politics also in the acts of the European Union, in the foreign policy of the European Union? Because you're kind of pretending that you're acting in a power vacuum. how can the European Union talk with one voice when the interests are different, also the economic interests? How do you see the future of global governments and the role of the EU in this system?
You know, that's the case wherever in the world, and that's true for the United States. Who do you think is behind the Helms-Burton Act? I tell you, it's Florida and New Jersey. That's behind the Helms-Burton Act. So we have regional interests in Europe, and at the end of the day, we have to have a compromise and say, yes, we give in to the French and the Germans a little bit, but not enough, and so on and so on. You come to a compromise, just as the United States Senate, the United States Congress, and the United States administration has to come to a compromise between different interests in the different regions of the United States. That's a normal democratic process, and that we have to organize it better. I accept this. But that's how it has to go.
Yeah,
but it's not different from the United States.
Yeah, but what I mean is the market is good, regulation is bad, but if free trade affects my interests, then I want regulations.
That's another problem. And that should be nuanced. No, those are general
That's the idea
statements.
of protectionism in the end.
I don't see the relationship with your previous question. But if your what you imply is that if France is protectionist, the European Union is going to be protectionist, this could be the case in the United States also. If Seattle wants to defend Boeing, and the United States Senate takes over the position of Boeing, you will have a protectionist policy in favor of Boeing. But I hope that we will wise enough not to give in to the protectionist tendencies in whichever country, whether it's France or another one, and that the United States will be wise enough not to give in to the protectionist tendencies which exist also, you know. Your textile industry in North Carolina and so on, they have a powerful voice in the Senate, and you have to find a compromise between all those interests.
Let me give the floor to Tim Arnold, who's actually the head of the Marshall Committee, who's co-sponsoring this event.
Thank you.
Thank you, and it's a truly transatlantic effort with many other students who are here taking part from many different nations. Ambassador Pammon, most of us here at the School of Government realize that your task is a very exciting one, but at the same time I imagine it to be very awkward at times to be a senior EU diplomat, because here in the West you face a nation that's steered European or Western European affairs for 50 years, and yet you must tell them, I'm sorry, we still don't have this one phone number for you to call. And your colleagues in the East face nations that for 8 years now have undergone a tremendous change in all parts of their lives, and yet your colleagues must tell them, we are sorry, please understand that we really must adjust our institutions, and some of you will become members, but still we must sort out our voting rights and adjust the common agricultural policy and so on. So from this, 3 questions arise. Number one, is perhaps the foreign policy of the European Union a typical intergovernmental affair that should not have been a pillar of the Maastricht Treaty, but should be integrated at the very end? Second, your native country is a member of the Eurocorps, with flexibility being discussed at the Intergovernmental Conference. Would you imagine a core group of European countries to move ahead, merging their embassies and adopting something like a common foreign and security policy? And third, after answering no to the first 2 questions, who will then implement the cultural implications of the new transatlantic agenda? The Joint Action Plan, as you mentioned, lists universities and many other entities. That's fascinating, but who's going to coordinate these issues which are jealously guarded by the nation states?
Well, a general answer is that I am not unhappy at all where I am. I find it fascinating, and with all the limits of the job, which are real, I still think, I hope, it's worthwhile doing, because of the fact that you have to be aware of what is formally the case and the situation, and what has its limits and regularly proves to be the limits, and the real world and the reality. We take, but nearly on a permanent basis, decisions on foreign policy, European Union. We have, in practice, a common foreign policy. Problem is when it becomes difficult, when it's about former Yugoslavia, when it's about the Middle East, we have difficulties to have our act together. But on a day-to-day basis, I can tell you, we have a common foreign policy which we implement on a day-to-day basis. So it is not that frustrating situation as you imagine, in which I am not at all, and I enjoy it every day. So there's not that those limitations. The development of a Eurocorps in Europe is one of the possibilities. Yes, Belgium is member of the Eurocorps. There are other member states. We are now in a development where we will have certain activities which will not be shared by others. In fact, we have it already, as you know. Not everybody will be member of the Economic and Monetary Union. The UK hasn't signed the social clause, and so on. So the future is going to be that, yes, on certain areas, a certain number of things will be done by certain member states. That, I think, is the normal development. The question is going to be, will that create a dynamism which makes that those who are lagging behind will try to join as soon as possible? If this is a permanent situation, then we are in trouble. If, for instance, the United Kingdom would never become a member of or never sign the social legislation of the European Union, we're in trouble. And certainly if they would never become a member of the European Union, we are not going to have a real European monetary union. The question is whether we can create a dynamism in certain areas where those who are capable of going in a certain direction will convince the others and attract the others to join them as soon as possible. That's what happened until now, all over. And I'm sure it's going to happen in social policy, and I'm absolutely sure it's going to happen in economic and monetary union. So for the moment we are on track. And I'm personally convinced it's going to happen in common and foreign policy too. It's a question of process. It's going to take some time, but I think it's going to happen. Cultural affairs are of course somewhat different. I don't want to be too provocative, but what is European culture? It's clear that we have a notion of what European culture is in general terms, but in practice this is about people who live in a certain environment, and that environment is very often determined by the context in which they live. In other words, we will have more or less national cultural developments, mainly national cultural developments, but we have already a lot of trans-border cultural activities. And that's what we try to do in Washington, for instance. We have a lot of activities where a certain number of member states participate, and not always all of them. Because if you have to wait until the last one who has got authority from his capital to participate in the budget, you never do something. So you do it with those who are ready to do it. And I think that's how it's going to work in cultural affairs. But I don't think that the European Union has to have a very developed cultural policy in the name of the European Union. I very easily let the national ambassadors dealing with their national cultural activities. There's no problem for me. Well, now you are on a very critical issue, you know. And if you all promise me not to reveal what I'm going to say, then I will give you my personal opinion. But you know what the official position is. All languages of the European Union are official languages of the European Union. So there is no distinction between languages at all, be it Irish or English or Danish or Finn or whatever, they all have the same status. They are all official languages. In practice, of course, we have two working languages, English and French. That's what the day-to-day business in Brussels is about. That's less the case in other institutions because ministers, very often pushed by their constituency, want to speak the language of their country, and that's quite normal. In the European Parliament also, people have the possibility to speak their languages. In the reality, we will have, I imagine, for quite a while to work what we call working languages, not without difficulties. For instance, with the Germans, and for good reasons. You know that even before the German unification, the German-speaking group in the European Union was the most populous group in the European Union. Now they have added 18 million German-speaking people, and we have Austria with us. So the German-speaking group is by far the largest group in the European Union. And in practice, I'm sorry to say so, German is not really in practice a working language as are English and French. It probably has to do with the fact that it's a very difficult language, I don't know. It has always also to do with the fact that when we were only 6, there was only one language, which was French. And the Germans have done a major effort to speak French. All the high officials in the Commission nearly speak or French or English. So that helps. There's also Spanish, of course, which is a world language spoken all over the world, and which could claim to be a working language. The reality is that there are two working languages, and we can live with that, I think.
A year ago, there was some enthusiasm in the media and the corporate and political worlds for the work of the TABD, the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. Last month when we were in Brussels, Leon Britton spoke very highly of its work, saying it had worked wonders in exposing the turf battles between the two countries for what they were.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
For exposing the real domain of the battles between the EU and the US.
Yeah.
But given difficulties since its meeting in Chicago, particularly in the realm of pharmaceuticals, as we've discussed, and it seems to me the fading interest of some of the CEOs, despite an initial commitment to it, now they seem to be losing interest. Do you think it can play any significant role in the future of transatlantic relations?
The answer is yes. I'm a great fan of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. For those who don't know what it is about, it is the following. We thought at a certain moment that the interdependence, which I talked about in the beginning, between the United States and Europe has now reached such a degree that we thought that perhaps we should change our procedures. The procedures before were that officials of the United States and Europe negotiated a trade agreement or whatever agreement, and then went to their business constituency and said, that's the best deal we have negotiated for you, try to make the best out of it. That is how it normally works. We think that perhaps in the transatlantic market, as we call it these days, we should do it differently. And the great innovation of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue is about that. We have inversed the procedure, the sequence of involvement in negotiations. Now we say to the business community, you are going to tell us what your problems are. You are going to negotiate between yourselves what you think the best solutions are to your problems, and then you come to the government. And you tell the government that you have sit together, that you have negotiated, that you have identified the problem, and that you have identified the best solution to the problem. And now you put the government before its responsibilities. That's the new innovation of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. And that worked already. In the car industry, for instance, we had a big conference for the car industry in Washington, where exactly the car industries from both sides of the Atlantic came together, identified a series of real problems which they had in the working of the so-called transatlantic market, and made recommendations to the governments. And it's then for the governments to take their responsibility, whether they follow the business community or whether they don't. And I think that's the way in which it should be done in the future. So I'm very much in favor of transatlantic business. It's true that it has perhaps a little bit, hasn't worked too well the last months, but it had to do with the fact that, as you know, there were problems with the chairman on the European side. Mr. Timmer from Philips had problems with his own company, so it was difficult to remain the chairman of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue on the European side, but those were problems which in the meantime have been solved. The fact that they decided that MRAs were the real issue indicates that they had really identified the real problems, because that's where we are stuck. And we had great illusions when we started a transatlantic business dialogue. We thought that we would have every 6 months a series of sectors where we would have the same kind of negotiations as we have now about pharmaceutical, medical devices, telecommunications, and so on. But we are still wrestling with the first 7 sectors. But I think it's the way in which at least the business community should be involved in the transatlantic activities.
Hi. If you were a betting man, would you bet that Italy and Spain joined the first round of EMU on time in 1999? And if so, does that imply a liberal interpretation of the Maastricht Treaty, or do you think they can meet specific requirements that are laid out by that treaty?
Again, I will tell you my personal opinion, but on the condition that it is not revealed anywhere. If tomorrow I read it somewhere, I will deny it, absolutely, so you're warned. Well, I will tell you the following. Economic and Monetary Union is going to start on the 1st of January 1999. There's no doubt about that. If only because it has been decided by unanimity, and in order not to do it, you have to decide by unanimity not to do it. Never you will have a unanimous decision in the European Council of Ministers not to do Economic and Monetary Union. So it's going to happen. There's no doubt about it. The question is not whether it's going to happen or not. The question is whether it's going to be credible. And the credibility, of course, is going to depend on who is going to be on board, and who is going to be on board in the first phase of Economic and Monetary Union. Now, it's for me absolutely clear that will be on board on the 1st of January 1999, France, Germany, the Benelux countries, Austria, Finland. Then that's, for me, is sure. Then you have now a serious situation which has been created by the enormous effort which 3 countries of the southern part of Europe have made in terms of improving their economies and improving their debt situation, their budgetary balances, and so on, in such a way that they now come very, very close to the so-called convergence criteria, which are a condition to become a member of Economic and Monetary Union. It's very likely that when next year, because all this is going to be decided next year at the end of May, in the month of May, more or less, so in 1 year from now, it's very likely that at that moment, Portugal will be in a better position in terms of convergence criteria than Germany. So that's going to be a very difficult situation. How can you exclude Portugal if it has better results in terms of convergence criteria than Germany? Of course, they have to be part of it. The same could be, not the same situation, but a similar situation could be the case with Spain. It's very likely that Spain will comply with all the convergence criteria in a year from now. If you have read the latest report of the Economic Commission, in fact, that's going to be the case. The only difficulty is Italy. And again, I don't want to be said that outside. But the real problem is Italy. Because, according to our forecasts, in a year from now, Italy could well comply with the criteria. But it's pretty sure that the year after, they won't comply anymore. In other words, it's the question of the sustainability of their compliance with the criteria of economic and monetary union. And that's going to be a very difficult decision, because also Mr. Prodi has made an enormous effort. Italy has come down from 6.4% deficit budget 4 years ago to now 3.2%. So they have made an enormous effort, as have done other countries, as I said. So on the one hand, it would be somewhat unjust not to take that into account and to reward them for the efforts which they have made. And it's very unpopular. You know, the Italians have introduced a Euro tax. Can you imagine? A Euro tax. People have to pay a special tax to become a member of Economic and Monetary Union. It's the only country in the community, in the European Union, where you could think of introducing a Euro tax. And all the rest, people would rather go away from Economic and Monetary Union without tax. They have introduced a tax. So it would be up to a certain point a dramatic decision not to have Italy. But it's very likely that for reasons of sustainability, Italy will not be part of the first wave of Economic and Monetary Union. But that's my forecast. And again, the decision will be taken in a year from now.
We've reached the end of our time here. Do you want to say one concluding word after Anu?
I think I have spoken too much already. Thank you very much.